Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, thank you, Professor Martinez, for your welcome, and thank you, everyone here, for welcoming me, and thank you for being here. It really is a great honour for me to be here in this context. I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoint, and what I'm going to be looking at tonight is the question of whether the Gospels, by which we mean Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the four Gospels in the New Testament, are by eyewitnesses. Now, you'll know that there are a great variety of views that you can get about Jesus. I just saw a car sticker on the way here, what would Jesus bomb? Which I thought was a very interesting one as a perspective on Jesus. And when you go to the academic study of the Bible, you also find a great variety of opinions. You could go to universities in different countries and be taught different things. You could go to universities in the same country and also be taught different things. You could take different time periods, what was taught 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or now, and find variety. When you look at books on the historical Jesus, you also find variety, and people have been commenting for some time how often the pictures of Jesus that people write about in their investigations of what Jesus was like often reflect the views of the author themselves, because they often make a Jesus rather like themselves. So what I want us to do tonight is to step back and have a look at some of the indications we get from the Gospels themselves. I'm not going to be offering something dreadfully profound and cutting edge, but I hope nevertheless we will get a chance to think together. I want us to begin, however, with quite a bit of time spent on non-Christian writings. You might think that's rather bizarre. If I'm going to be looking at Christian writings, why start with non-Christian writings? Well, I do this because obviously non-Christian writings can't be accused of a Christian bias. So I want to look at some well-known passages which talk about the beginnings of Christianity, but which are written by non-Christian authors, and three in particular: Tacitus, Pliny, and Josephus. And I begin the story with a Roman author, Tacitus, who became a prominent person in Roman public life, who was born around the year 56 and writes here in this selection from his Annals about the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. He, of course, lived in Rome. Okay, he was a young boy at the time, but this fire took place in the city in which he lived. And as anyone who studies ancient history knows, he's actually reasonably close. People often have to look at ancient historians and trust them when they're talking about things a lot further before their lives and a lot further away. And here he writes about the Great Fire of Rome, which he said that Nero, the emperor, started. We get into his story. But neither help by humans, nor generous gifts from the emperor, nor all the ways of placating heaven, could stifle the scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. That means order of Nero. Therefore, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class of men, loath for their vices, whom the crowd call Christians. So here we have that mention of the word Christian and how Nero blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome. The very word Christian is, of course, interesting. Christian is derived from the name Christ, or Latin Christus, Greek Christos, which ultimately goes back to the Hebrew word for Messiah. So if we have a group of people called Christians, they are presumably a group who believe that the Jewish Messiah has arrived. So we can infer a certain amount of their belief from this passage. He then continues, Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, the emperor from the year 14 through to the year 37, by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, who was governor of Judea from the year 26 through to the year 36. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, British spelling, the home of the disease, but in the capital, that's Rome itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and become fashionable. So that was his opinion of his own city. So notice how he confirms some things that you would read about in the Gospels. All four Gospels report that it was under Pontius Pilate that Jesus was condemned. And of course it gives you some time span during which Jesus must have died, sometime between the year 26 and the year 36. It also confirms the geographical origins of Christianity as being in Judea. The New Testament says it was in Jerusalem that these things all began. First, then, he continues, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on account of arson as for hatred of the human race. They said it about Christians back then, they say it now. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Now, I'm not going to offer anything very profound to say about this passage, except that it seems to me from this that it was quite difficult to be a Christian at this particular time, and that there were very large numbers of Christians in Rome. That's all I want to establish. But I do think that that does tell us something about the origins of Christianity, which I want to have as background information. Namely, the further Christianity spreads, the faster it spreads, the harder it is for certain models of the invention of Christian belief to work. We'll return to that point. The next writer is Pliny the Younger, who was governor of Bithynia, that's northwest Turkey, around the year 111 through to 113. So let's split the difference and put this letter that he writes to the emperor at the year 112. It's a public letter, but he's writing to the emperor asking for advice on how to deal with those awkward Christians. And so this is what he says. We're about 80 years after Christianity began at this point. I interrogated these people as to whether they were Christians. If they confessed, I interrogated them a second and a third time, threatening punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off, namely to execution. As for those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words given by me, and prayed with incense and wine offerings to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this very purpose, along with the images of the gods, and also cursed Christ, which it said that no true Christian could ever be compelled to do, I thought they should be discharged. So you can see he's a nice guy. If it's only the people who persist as Christians that we want to kill. If they renounce the faith, that's all right. So he's got some tests for whether people are Christians or not. And one of the tests is, are they prepared to worship the emperor? Are they prepared to worship the Roman gods? And another one is, are they prepared to curse Christ? Now, the logic of those first two, are they prepared to worship and use particular words and sacrifice to emperor, gods, and so on? The logic of that is that, of course, a real Christian can't do that. That's the logic of Pliny's test. Why else would he apply it? And it fits with something we know about Judaism. Now, I won't patronise you with asking how many gods Jews believed in, because you know that the basic answer is one. And one of those things about Jews that was so prominent is that, of course, they did not worship any other being. So it seems here we have, in the most natural reading of things, knowing that Christianity began as a movement from within Judaism, the most natural reading of things is that that belief has continued. They are still only prepared to worship one God, and that is one of the reasons that people can be shown not to be Christians if they worship other gods. He then continues. Others named in the document, there was a particular document denouncing people as Christians. Others named in the document said that they were Christians, but later denied it, saying that they had been, but they'd ceased 3 years ago, or many years ago, or even as much as 20. So we go back, if you like. It's not quite strict maths, but let's go from mathematics. Math. You can call it math, don't you? We've got an S in Britain, don't know why. Can't count, maybe. Going back to the year 112, and we're somewhere around the year 92, if we go back 20 years. Here we have reports of what people who had renounced the Christian faith reported went on in their meetings. And, the straightforward way of reading Pliny is that this was the way meetings had been going on for a long time. So back, if you like, we have a description of a first century Christian meeting, almost, in this text. They said that this had been the full extent of their guilt or error. They'd been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn, and to sing antiphonally, one group to another, a song to Christ as to a god, and to bind themselves by an oath not to some crime, but rather not to commit theft, robbery, or adultery, not to break their trust, and not to refuse to return a pledge when asked to do so. So a certain amount of honesty emphasised in their meetings, but one of the striking things is here they are, worshipping Christ as a God, and of course he's writing in Latin, so there's no word a, so whether quasi-deo means as to a God or as to God, we can't really decide, but we do know that of course Jews only believe in one God. And we've just been thinking about how one of the tests for whether someone's a Christian is, are they prepared to worship another being? And the very next thing we find out is here these Christians are worshipping God. And they're worshipping Christ as God. It's quite striking to me, because it seems that here we have evidence from a non-Christian text of the early inclusion of Christ as one to be worshipped. Now, a common view of how this has happened is that gradually over time, people came to have more and more exalted views of Christ. Perhaps at one stage, they viewed him as sort of semi-divine, and then eventually, over a long period of time, exalted to God himself. The problem with this is, in one sense, the nature of the divine. You see, for the Jews, there is only one God, and there isn't a quality of the divine which can be inferred, bestowed onto people. You can't have a half God. You can't have a divine being in the sense that the Greeks could have. If Zeus looks down, finds a pretty woman, gets together, and you can produce a half God. That's possible because divine being is a sort of essence. One of the points that's been made powerfully by Richard Borkham in his book, God Crucified, a beautiful, just 100-page book, but with a very profound argument, is how amongst the Jews there was a divine identity, and that was the focus, not on divine essence. And therefore, if they are worshipping Christ, it is because they have identified Christ as that God, not that he is on some journey gradually to be exalted as God. He then continues, many people of every age, every rank, and of both sexes are being and will be called to trial. Nor is it only cities that are affected, but the disease of this superstition is also reaching villages and farmsteads. It seems possible to check and correct this. It's pretty well agreed that the temples, which had almost become deserted, have now begun to be frequented again. And all the sacred rites, which had been neglected for a long time, are recommencing, and the flesh for sacrificial rites is being sold, for which up to now it was hard to find a purchaser. Now let's just think about this. Here we have the governor of northern Turkey, northwest Turkey, writing to the emperor around the year 112, saying that so many people in his area had become Christians that the temples are almost deserted and people are buying sacrificial meat. Now, of course, we can allow a certain amount of rhetoric. He might, I suppose, be trying to show what a good job he has been doing. There's a certain amount of bias we can allow for, but it's still a very striking thing. How many people became Christians? Because the further and the faster Christianity spreads, the harder it is to have the fundamental elements of the Christian message being created many decades after Christianity has begun to spread. So those are just two non-Christian witnesses about the beginnings of Christianity. Coming on to a third one, and one far closer to the place where it all began, is Josephus. Flavius Josephus was born around the year 37. There are two passages in which he writes about Jesus, and the other one is disputed. So we're not going to look at that other, more interesting passage. We're going to look at the less interesting passage, where he simply mentions Jesus in passing, not in such a way that it in any way suggests that this has been tampered with by a Christian. The most natural reading of this is that it's in his style, it fits his overall argument that these are his words. He writes about what happened in his hometown of Jerusalem when he is around age 25. There is a power vacuum, and the high priest seizes power, and it says this: he, that's Ananus, the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had made an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he handed them over to be stoned. Well, it's a striking thing there. What we have is the emphasis on James, the brother of Jesus. You can actually read about Jesus having a brother called James in the New Testament, both in Matthew and in Mark. And there are records in the New Testament about how this person became a leader in the early church. This is simply to point out that it's not just that we have people a long way away who appear to be dying for their Christian faith, very removed from the events. We also have them close up. So if I were just to summarise, I'd say that there is a basic agreement between the non-Christian evidence, limited as it is, and the Christian evidence as to the fact that Christians were generally suffering for their beliefs, not in every situation, not at every time, and that Christianity was spreading far and fast. Now, in the very nature of things, when we're looking for evidence of Jesus, most of the evidence is going to be by people who are interested in Jesus, particularly Christians. It's the same, most things written about golf are by golf enthusiasts, most things written about computers are by computer enthusiasts. It's in the nature of things. So we can't expect there to be masses and masses of non-Christians writing about Jesus at the earliest stage. So I want us to come to the Christian evidence, the Christian writings, and consider them and look at the internal grounds there might be for trusting them or distrusting them. I begin with a little saying from a popular book by Bart Ehrman, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a prominent New Testament textual critic. This is what he says about how stories might have arisen. What do you suppose happened to the stories, that's the stories about Jesus, over the years as they were told and retold, not as disinterested news stories reported by eyewitnesses, but as propaganda meant to convert people to faith, told by people who had themselves heard them 5th or 6th or 19th hand? Did you or your kids ever play the telephone game at a birthday party? Now, admittedly, it's not written in an academic journal, and it's not quite in the style you would put in a journal either. But it's a striking thing because it reveals what some people may think as to how the stories arose. Stories are told from one person to another, telephone game style. Remember, the telephone game is, of course, a game made up deliberately in order to corrupt the message. You have to whisper, you have to say it once, you can only hear it from one person. There have to be lots of links. You don't just play the telephone game with 3 people. So all of the rules are set up to corrupt the message. But that's his analogy for how Christianity began, and I've heard that analogy used on many occasions. We know that messages could become corrupted. I don't deny it. The question is that a relevant model for how Christianity began? And here we have a reputable scholar claiming that it is. I want us to begin with the question of where the Gospels were written. There are traditional views on this subject, not all of them equally early. The earliest mention of Matthew having been written in Judea is Jerome in the 4th century, although it's implied in some earlier writings that that was the location. But otherwise, the traditions that we have about particular Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John is that they were written outside the land that the stories of Jesus are set in, outside Israel or Palestine, whatever you choose to call it. When we look at another New Testament scholar, Gerd Tyson from Germany, when he looks at where the Gospels were written, he has Matthew and Mark in Syria, Luke probably in Rome, and John being a team effort, starting to be written in Palestine, Syria, and then finished off in Asia Minor. What we see that his view has in common with a traditional view, and his view is not at all atypical, is that it supposes that the majority of the Gospels, at least 3, were written outside the land of Jesus' activity. Or come back to Bart Ehrman. Where then did these anonymous Greek-speaking authors, the Gospel authors, living probably outside of Palestine some 35 to 65 years after the events that they narrate, get their information? That's his question. There, presupposing that the authors were generally outside the land. Now, this is something you can find as a consensus across different scholars of different views, that most of the Gospels were written outside the land. Now, I find that absolutely fascinating, because I then think, if people were to create stories outside the land, and were to do it with accurate information about the land, what information would they need? I just had the pleasure, a few moments ago, of walking round a little bit of your beautiful campus. I guess I could have looked it all up on the internet before, but I hadn't. And so I didn't know what your library looked like. I didn't know all sorts of things. I didn't know some of the greenery that you would have on those buildings. There are all sorts of things that someone who hasn't been to a particular place doesn't know. When you go and travel to a new place, of course, you've heard about it beforehand. You may have heard about it for many years, but you still go and your eyes see, and you're often surprised, and you think, why did no one ever tell me about that particular aspect of things? And we have the same sort of thing with the Gospels. We can ask questions. Do they know about what is planted in the land? Do they know about the shapes of the buildings? When they describe the temple, do they describe it accurately? Do they know about large stones or the shape of houses? Do they know the right culture, the coinage? Do they know the places, the place names, where the land goes up and down and travelling distances? Do they know anything about local language? And so on. I've just given you a few tests here that we can ask about the Gospels. Now, the reason these become important is not that if you can show that the Gospels get one of these right, that means that the Gospel writers are telling the truth on everything they say, including when they talk about miracles. It's not that at all. It's rather that if people were making up stories, you would need a huge attention to detail and a vast amount of research to get these sort of things right. And even if you were living in the land, some of these things would be hard to get right, as we'll go on to see. The first test I want to look at is simply the test of what people were called. We'll look at this in a bit of detail. There's been some study done in the last few decades about Jewish personal names. What were the most common names at the time? People can look on bone boxes called ossuaries. They can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. They can look at a historian like Josephus or someone like Philo. And they can ask, what were the most common names that people had at the time? And from this, there have been about 3,000 known different names with a number of different individuals. Far more individuals, but those different names that we have. And what's been shown is that the Jewish names in Palestine show a different frequency from Jewish names elsewhere, and the Gospels and Acts are often thought to have been written, Acts being a sort of sequel to Luke, one of the Gospels, telling you the story of the early church. They're often thought to have been written outside Palestine, and yet they seem to reflect the right naming patterns. Let's look at that in a bit of detail. Now, I've cribbed this from Richard Baucham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a 500-page book by a British academic, which I'd commend to your study, which lays out just some of this sort of evidence. He's building on the work of a German scholar called Tal Ilan, and if you suffer from insomnia, you might want to buy her lexicon of Jewish proper names. Now, what can be said here is we can look at what is the most popular name for, that is the most frequent name for individuals, Jewish men in Israel, Palestine, in the New Testament. We find that Simon is the most popular name. It also happens to be the most popular name in Josephus, a writer from the period, or in the ossuaries, the bone boxes, and the second most popular name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The second most popular name in the New Testament for men is Joseph or Joseph. It's also the second most popular in Josephus. It's also the second most popular in the Dead Sea Scroll, and in the ossuaries, and narrowly the most popular in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can look at some patterns which show up over names as a whole. Take those top two names and say, where do they occur as a proportion of all names? Well, outside the New Testament, you're between 15 and 16%. Inside the New Testament, that's about 18%. Pretty close. Take the top 9 men's names outside the New Testament, and they occur at something like 41%. Inside the New Testament, it's about 40%. As the data sample gets bigger, so the numbers get closer. Now, this is a pattern which is showing up over 4 different writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, writing 5 different books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Broadly speaking, it's also the pattern that they show individually. It's quite a striking thing. With women, there was a little bit less data and also less imagination about what to call people. But we can still say the most popular name outside the New Testament was Mary. The most popular name inside the New Testament was Mary. You can look at how men were called in one land Jewish men, and you can also compare it with names that they had in another land. There were many men, Jews, in Alexandria, in Egypt. And you can find that, in fact, the names give some rather different ranks. Again, I'm using Borkham's work here. And so rather than Simon being the most popular name, suddenly in at number 2 on the charts is Sabbathias. Now, have any of you ever come across someone called Sabbathias? No. Have you come across someone today called Ptolemaeus or Pappus? Why not? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they had been, those might have become quite popular names. So we can see a rather striking thing here, that the sort of pattern of names we have in the New Testament broadly correlates with names that we have outside the New Testament. How can we explain that? Well, before explaining that, there's a further feature I want you to look at. When you have names which are the most popular names, there is a problem of ambiguity. You call out a name like Simon, and of course there are lots of Simons. So what you find is, in order to disambiguate, what they do is they add something to the name Simon. So, Jesus has 12 disciples. 2 of them have the name Simon. One has Simon with the extra bit Simon Peter, or Cephas. The other one is Simon the Zealot, or Simon the Canaanite. He has an extra bit. In the Gospels, it records how Jesus goes and has a meal with someone called Simon the leper, who isn't a leper at the time because people are eating with him. And then you have Simon Peter going in the book of Acts to stay with someone called Simon the tanner, or the leather worker. Famously, the person who helped carry Jesus' cross is called Simon of Cyrene. You take the Marys. Mary Magdalene. You add something extra. She came from Magdala. Or you say Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, another name you get in the Gospels. Now what we find is that these disambiguators are occurring with the most frequent names and not with the less frequent names as a broad pattern. That's a striking thing. Because if people were making up stories, why would they put those disambiguators on if they're outside the land when those names aren't so common? Well, let's put it like this. Let's say I ask you to write a story about what happened in Libya 100 years ago. I'm assuming some of you may be from Libya, but let's assume you're not. You're writing a story about what happened in that land 100 years ago. Can you give people the right sort of names? Well, you might know that Gaddafi is a Libyan name, or Al-Magrah is a Libyan name. You might have some general idea of Arabic names, less likely to know much about Berber names or any other sort of language groups there might be there. How would you know how names there differed from, other countries? If you get some Arab names, would you know how Arab names differ from country to country? I imagine that you get different patterns of name in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and so on. No, you wouldn't. In fact, you probably wouldn't even be very good at doing it in your own country for 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even now. Because we find that often our intuitions as to what is a common name are not very reliable. A couple of stories to illustrate that. One is the story, maybe some of you are too young to appreciate this, of when people give a child a name. They spend a lot of time wrestling over a name, and they want to give that child a distinctive name, an unusual name. They give the child a name, only to find out the next week that someone else they know has given the same name to their child. This actually happens quite frequently. Or you meet someone who has an unusual name. You've never come across anyone with that name before, and you meet them, and then the next week you meet another person with the same unusual name. How does that happen? It happens because our intuitions as to what are common and frequent are not very reliable. We know what the most popular names are sometimes because we've read the magazine article. But sometimes when we read the magazine article that tells us what the most popular names are, we're actually surprised. Oh really, is that the most popular name? In other words, if someone were to make up a story, fill it with characters, and try and make sure that they appear in the right relative proportion to each other, it is somewhat difficult. Now, there's a further aspect to this. Does any of you ever admit to struggling to remember names? I must say that I do. I've forgotten quite a few people's names tonight, about 10 already. Okay, just since I've been introduced, you can reintroduce yourself later. Names are very easy to forget. And one of the reasons why is that there's no logical reason why someone should have a particular name. Sometimes there are logical reasons why someone should not have that particular name, but that's an issue for their parents. But the point is, names are very difficult to remember. We watch a film, we remember the storyline, we remember what the minor characters did, but we may well forget their names, and we may even forget the names of the major characters, but still remember that story for a long time. In other words, names are not the sort of things that attach themselves to stories in the correct proportion as those stories get told from mouth to mouth over many different steps. It doesn't seem to work that way at all. And we can also say that if the Gospels, if names are really hard to remember and the Gospels have got them right, then they're actually getting right a detail that is very hard to remember. So if they can get correct a detail which is very hard to remember, isn't there every reason to think that they might be able to get the other things correct? When we also bring in a control group, namely apocryphal Gospels, particularly from the 2nd century and 3rd century, and we ask, what sort of names do they have? We can look at the Gospel of Thomas that some people talk about. How well does it do on names? Well, most of the names it seems to have come straight from the New Testament, and some of them are without disambiguators. The Gospel of Mary, which is a fragmentary work, simply has 5 names. It doesn't even have the name Jesus, simply the name Saviour is there. And it's the Gospel of Mary, and Mary was the most common woman's name, and we do not know which Mary it's supposed to be by. I mean, it may not be, probably isn't by any Mary, but the point is, we don't even know which one it's supposed to be, because Mary might have worked as a pretty unambiguous term outside the land, but inside the land it would have been ambiguous. Then a few Easters ago, I think it's 2006, these things tend to come out at Easter, like Jesus' tomb was announced like this Easter again. So the Gospel of Judas came out. How many correctly placed names does it have for Palestine? Judas and Jesus, and then a lot of figures from outer space. Babylon, Nebro, and so on. It doesn't seem to know the time and place very well. So I'd say there's a sort of control, if you like, a contrast with the Gospels, showing what they could have been like, but aren't. Let's look at the test a little bit more. Go to Matthew's Gospel, and we look at the list of the 12 disciples according to Matthew. I've then put in parentheses when that disciple's name is in the top 99 names as listed by Orkham. If it's not got a bracket after it, then it's not in the top 99. And what we find is that whenever it's one of the most popular names, it has a disambiguator, and when it's not, it doesn't. So Simon, ranked number 1, called Peter, disambiguator. Andrew, his brother. Now Andrew's just given with reference to Simon. James, popular name, ranked number 11, the son of Zebedee. And John, his brother, explained with reference to James. Philip, low ranking, 61st equal, and Bartholomew, low ranking, 50th equal, no disambiguators. Thomas, not even on the charts, no disambiguator. Matthew, high ranking, 9, the tax collector. James, high ranking, the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, low ranking, 39th equal, no disambiguator. Simon, high ranking, the Cananean, and Judas, high ranking, Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now I know there are other things going on in that list. You've got to distinguish 2 disciples in a couple of cases, but it's interesting that when you do have 2 disciples, you have 2 disciples with the more popular names, who, if they were making up a list of 12 disciples, would duplicate names anyway. It's the sort of shape of list that you would expect to be needed in the land itself with that disambiguation. Once the list travels, of course, why would it need to get those sorts of things right? And what we're finding is a correlation between the form of the text then and statistics that have only been known for the last 10 years. To me, that's quite striking. We could look at some speech in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, John is a popular name, the 5th most popular name for Jewish men in Palestine. When the story is then told of John the Baptist, of course the narrator can simply talk about John, but the characters in the narrative can't talk about John because the question would be which John? So when it is reported that Herod has heard of Jesus and thinks this is John the Baptist, he can't just say to his servants, this is John, because his servants would have asked, which John? And so he asks, and he says to his servants, this is John the Baptist. Then the narrative continues. Next verse, Herod seized John. Next verse, John said. So the narrator is speaking one way, and the character in the narrative is speaking another way. And of course, the character in the narrative is speaking how a character in the narrative would have had to have spoken in order to be clear in that context. Then Herodias' daughter doesn't like John the Baptist, so she wants him beheaded. So she asks for the head. She can't just say, give me the head of John. She might have got the head of the wrong John. So she asks for the head of John the Baptist. Then the narrator continues, so he, that's Herod, sent and beheaded John. So you see that characters speak one way and the narrator speaks another way. Now, of course, that could be very clever narration, and I'm sure it is. And you could say, well, it's not really a sign that you're getting what they actually said, it's a sign you've got a clever narrator. Yes, but the cleverer you make the narrator, the harder it is to say that the narrator got things wrong through bungling incompetence. You do sort of have those two basic methods. Is it that these people are very clever, conspiracy theories need them to be super clever, and then there are the bungling incompetence theories that require them to be stupid? Another name, the name Jesus. Actually, Jesus was a popular name at the time. It's simply a version of the name Joshua. And it was the sixth most common name. There are other Jesuses mentioned in the New Testament as well. Jesus called Justus, or Bar-Jesus. Now, there's a striking thing about speech in the Gospels that I only noticed 2 years ago, and I don't think anyone noticed before that. What happens in the narration is generally Jesus is called Jesus. You didn't need to come tonight to hear that. But the characters in the narrative, when they're in crowd settings, don't just say, here comes Jesus, because the question would have been, which Jesus? So in fact, the characters in the narrative, the crowd, say, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee, with disambiguators. The narrator then continues, Jesus went into the temple. Or we could go on to a time when Peter denies Jesus thrice. Along, the narrator continues, Jesus said to him, then we have a servant girl come up to Peter and say, you were with Jesus, the Galilean. Next servant girl, slightly more clued up. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Then the narrator continues, Peter remembered the saying of Jesus. And it goes on. That is a pattern which can be found, in fact, through all four Gospels, with two exceptions. Thief on the cross, Jesus remember me, not a crowd situation. The narrator wants to make the point that he is only half seeing who has healed him, says, when he's asked who healed you, he said, a man called Jesus healed me. Well, that's not going to get you very far in the search for the man. We can also say that the pattern of naming is striking because when we look at the principal character in the Gospels, who is, of course, the guy with a name beginning with J. Now, the point about this, I should say the chap, just to introduce you to British culture, what does he call himself? The striking thing across the Gospels is the way Jesus speaks. His speech is actually different from later Christians. He doesn't teach on the sorts of things that later Christians might well have wished he would teach on, like what to do in a church service or what to do about including the Gentiles. And he teaches in things like parables, which the later Christians don't really use. But he also, as a favourite self-designation, talks about the Son of Man, which is again not a title that the early Christians used very much. They didn't, use it in their church services and so on. So what we find is a whole pattern of naming which fits if we have recording from the first generation and doesn't fit very well if it's going to be made up considerably later. We can look at Matthew, Mark, Luke and John and how they record the Son of Man, and we can see how, when compared with some of the Apocryphal Gospels, which are admittedly rather shorter, it uses that rather more. So I would say this pattern is consistent with being based on eyewitness testimony. It requires some tradition. It is inconsistent with the creation of characters in a Gentile-dominated context, well away from the origin of the events. And even a Jewish context might struggle to create characters with this profile. More briefly, some other tests. The test of geography. Do they know the time and place? There are many towns and villages mentioned in the Gospels. These are non-trivial things. Even the names of some of these, which are not attested outside the New Testament, require, if someone were to invent them, a significant local knowledge, because you have to be able to make them so that they fit the local languages, which they do. We could also say that when we compare them with some apocryphal Gospels, they don't do very well. I took the 4 Gospels, 12 to 14 towns each, a total of 23. The Gospel of Philip has 2 towns, Jerusalem and Nazareth, but it thinks that Nazareth is Jesus' middle name. So it's only actually got 1 town, which is correctly placed, and that's Jerusalem, and that's the capital. So it's not that impressive. Then we have the Gospels of Peter and of the Saviour. They have 1 name, 1 town, Jerusalem. Again, not very impressive. And the next 13 I could come across, no towns. So when we just look at the very obvious things, that the Gospels are mentioning all sorts of places, that when Jesus supposedly comes to the Mount of Olives, and there are some villages there, Bethany and Bethphage, the author seems to know about them. Now you couldn't go into a bookshop in Rome, or even anywhere else, and inquire about what the names of villages are near Jerusalem, because people didn't write about such uninteresting subjects. We could look at a saying from Matthew, that Jesus simply withdrew to Galilee, left Nazareth, and went and lived in Capernaum by the sea. How do the writers know that Capernaum is by the sea if they haven't been there? So we have these sorts of indications. Now, of course, someone can get these right and be writing historical fiction in the land. Any one of these tests is quite compatible with that. I want to just show you a pretty pattern. When we look at these 4 left-hand columns, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and the number of words therein, Luke being the longest. I've then given you 5 other Gospels, which are later and shorter. I want you to fix your eyes on those 4 left-hand columns. I've changed the slide to be the number of place names per Gospel. This is the number of words per Gospel. This is the number of place names per Gospel. Number of words, a number of place names. You get the impression that those 4 columns really haven't moved. This is something you can check with an English text. If you like, you just work out the number of place names there are and put them as a proportion of words, and you get this pattern. Apart from the Gospel of Peter, which is so short that it doesn't, statistical anomaly, we find that basically all of the Gospels have around 5 place names per 1,000 words. All of them. That wasn't known until 3 years ago. Now, it's quite a striking thing to me that they should all do that, have the same proportion of place names. Because I don't think it's the sort of pattern you would get if Gospel writers are putting in place names for verisimilitude. To make the story look authentic, I don't think you would get this evenness. How do we explain it? I have an explanation. Luke says to Mark, "Hey Mark, how many words do you have in your Gospel?" Mark goes through, carefully counting them all. Now, in manuscript in those days, they didn't have word divisions, but he counted very carefully. How many place names do you have in your Gospel? Well, back in those days, they didn't have capital and small letters. It made it harder to count place names. But he still went through and counted them, and Luke did a sum. Matthew and John heard about this, and so on. Or whoever wrote them. It doesn't really explain it. The best explanation is that we're talking about the same genre of material, the same kind of material across all of them. And that same kind is the kind which isn't putting in place names artificially. Because artificial putting in a place names, that sort of genre isn't going to work to get the same evenness. The sort of genre that will get the same evenness will be the sort of genre that is a naturally arising genre. That is one which is, for instance, coming out of the reporting and very naturally putting in place names as their relevance. Briefly, the test of language. Go to Mark's Gospel and we find that he knows the local dialect. He can quote lots of bits of Aramaic correctly. How does someone get that right? Well, you need to speak to local informants. You couldn't go into a bookshop and buy a book on, the local dialect any more than you could go and buy in a bookshop, how people speak in Louisiana and how to be like that. No offence to people from Louisiana, but you see, you just can't do that. You know, it just, people don't want to, there's no market. Maybe there is that book. And if it hasn't, we could create a market. Markets can be created. But also, when we look at Mark's Gospel, we see that it has Latin in it. You know, when it uses the word for centurion, it doesn't use the Greek word for centurion like the other Gospels, it uses the Latin word. Now, there's an early tradition that says this. Mark's Gospel was written in Rome on the basis of testimony given by Simon Peter, one of Jesus' disciples. To me, the linguistic evidence fits. It's not that another model can't explain it, it's just that it fits. I don't need to do any specific work to make it fit. Even in Mark's Gospel, we have the mention of Alexander and Rufus, which names we don't know otherwise, but very much fit, Rufus being a good Latin name. We could look at the criterion of embarrassment, very briefly. Just that there are all sorts of things in the Gospels that are basically embarrassing. I mean, why would you write a Gospel with the early Christian leaders denying Jesus, running away from Jesus, disciples misunderstanding, getting angry with each other, having arguments about who's the greatest? Why would you do it? Or the Jewishness of the Gospels. You see, one of the things we saw early on was that Christianity spread far and fast. And one of the things we do know is that very quickly Christianity became more dominated by Gentiles. That's one of the striking things about it. And yet when we read the four Gospels, they are very Jewish Gospels. When I read the Apocryphal Gospels, they are very un-Jewish Gospels. If the Gospels were written at a late stage, even 100 years or 70 years after Christianity had begun, without being somehow rooted back to people who knew its Jewish roots, how would you get this level of Jewishness? So when I look on all of these sorts of accounts, I see the Gospels seeming to make sense as having access to eyewitness material. I'm not claiming that every author was an eyewitness. I don't think Luke and Mark were. But that brings me on to my final thing, and that is, one of the ways we can deal with the question of the authenticity of the Gospels is if we can establish who wrote them independently. That is, if Matthew was written by a disciple of Jesus, if John was written by a disciple of Jesus, then those have to have been written sometime between in a lifetime that's compatible with having been a disciple of Jesus. Not very profound there. When we look at Mark and Luke, these people would be unknown were it not for the Gospels that are attributed to them. So there's no motive that's obvious why you would say Mark and Luke made those Gospels. And yet if Luke is a companion of Paul, who is active in the 50s and 60s and travels all around the Mediterranean, as his second volume, Acts, shows a vast knowledge of that, then that sort of puts a time limit on when that Gospel could have been written. It can only be written in the lifetime of someone who is active, travelling in their 50s, in the 50s and 60s of the first century. When we look at the traditions that there are about the early manuscripts, about the early Gospels, and here we have a manuscript of Luke followed by John from around the year 225, we see that here is the end of Luke's Gospel, and it says Gospel according to Luke, and here is the beginning Gospel according to John, and we can home in and see Gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Word, etc. Now, not only is this like 100 years before that great council that the Emperor Constantine called, and some people like to say that's when he chose the Gospels, so why is Luke before Mark 100 years before then, we might ask. But also, this and much other evidence shows early traditions that the Gospels really were written by these particular people. If they were written by particular people who had contact with Jesus or contact with early followers, then they cannot be very far removed in the time and place. Now, these things do not show that every part of the Gospels is true. They do not show that this is the inspired Word of God. But I think these things together do lead us to consider that the Gospels should be taken seriously as historical sources, that they do have access to eyewitness testimony, and that if you want to find out about Jesus, they are the best place to start. I'd better explain this slide. I'd forgotten about that. What I've done with the various tests is given you, if you like, a series of hurdles The Gospels could fall down at any one of those. When you start applying a whole number of tests, then they together give us a greater surety about the answer. And I'd encourage you to go away and consider various tests we could apply to the Gospels to see if they stand up. Over to you. I believe that microphones will be brought to you, and so if you want to ask questions, it was called a question and answer session, but it's certainly a question session, and there may be answers as well. Just raise your hand. Yeah. So.
When doing the count of the words in comparison to the number of times that the names were mentioned, what language was the count done in?
Do you mean when I had the 4 Gospels and 5 other Gospels? Very good question. With the 4 Gospels, I used Greek. With the Gospels that only survive in languages other than Greek, I used a formula to convert those back into Greek based on the number of words that Coptic translations of the New Testament have in proportion to Greek translations of the New Testament.
I have a maths question.
Oh, no.
Well, statistics. With regard to the naming for your control group, I'm wondering with what degree of confidence non-biblical texts can be used to determine their location and date with regard to popular names that are mentioned?
I need to make sure I'm understanding the question. Are you saying, to what extent can we be sure, for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us names from Judea and so on? Is that what you're wanting to know?
Well, sure, compared to a control group, because maybe that might be a really good way to date things or find the location for other texts, and does the biblical text.
Certainly it does seem that Josephus was a leader in the Jewish armies. He came from that land itself, and he reports a number of people in that land. So if you take him at face value, and we're not saying that he doesn't make up any characters, we're simply saying if you take up all of the characters that he has and he asserts to be historical, you do the same with the Osirids, which certainly come from the land, and so on. These are the statistics you get. I don't want to, push that too far into some realm of proof. I'm just wanting to say this is a pattern which is thoroughly consistent with an explanation that they are basing it on eyewitness testimony. It's a pattern that needs some sort of explanation.
I was wondering, the tradition I've heard is, in particular, that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark's Gospel when they were writing. And, I mean, certainly that's not, something like the density of place names isn't going to be able to be duplicated by that. But I was just wondering if you could say a few words on which parts of your metrics would be affected by that and which would not.
Thank you. A large number of scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. A slightly less large group, but still the majority, believe that Matthew and Luke also had another common source, which people give the name Q to, just for convenience. That's not a church tradition, that's a scholarly model which is built on internal evidence and simplicity. In terms of how that affects things, I'm trying to build a model of reading the text that we have, which will work regardless of the hypothesis you have about the synoptic relations. I do that because there are things which are only in Matthew, which he has to get from somewhere. There are things that are only in Luke, which he has to get from somewhere. I can run the place names through Q, and the place names are actually a slightly lower density than the other bits, which is quite striking. But then Q is supposedly only sayings of Jesus, so of course you'd expect a slightly lower density material. But basically, I would say the sort of arguments I use are independent of that. Now, I did highlight some of these arguments to one scholar who said, well, what Matthew does with words can't be based on eyewitnesses because of my literary model in which he's dependent on Mark at this point. At which point I want to say, well, let's just take the texts as they stand and look at them without any particular model. But I would be happy to run this with any of the common models. There is good historical information, good geographical information in all the different types of material we can get across the Gospels. Things that are shared between two Gospels, things in one Gospel, those patterns will be shown. At the back there.
Could you speak to any evidence for the resurrection outside of the New Testament?
Any evidence for the resurrection outside of the New Testament? Well, you're going to have to go reasonably late for anything direct saying he was raised from the dead. On the other hand, you could say, well, how does Christianity get started? I mean, something clearly begins and spreads very rapidly. So you do have a question as to what it is that happens. And if it is a Jesus movement without a resurrection, which some people try to argue there was one, you've got to work out how that's going to propagate itself and then be displaced by a Jesus movement with a resurrection. Then I would say, of course, that some of the prime evidence is the New Testament. Now you might say, well, I want evidence outside the New Testament. I would say the problem with that sort of, looking at that sort of question is that, how much evidence is there for ancient Egypt outside Egypt? I mean, how much evidence is there for pharaohs outside Egypt? And, you just get rid of a whole load. You do have to look at what the most pertinent evidence for a subject is. And the most pertinent evidence for the origins of Christianity is largely Christian literature, just as most of the things that talk about the origins of golf or anything like that will be by enthusiasts of that game. That's just the nature of the sources, and they shouldn't be discounted for that reason. No.
Talk a little bit about other questions that you'd like to answer in the future.
Other questions that I like to answer. Whoa! I mean, I don't know whether this is a softball or hardball. The question I was asked when I was interviewed at Cambridge was, is there anything you'd like to tell me about anything? Which actually just sort of like freaked me out. I like to answer questions generally, on the Bible and about Bible languages and Bible translations, and obviously more technical sorts of things on language can be very interesting. But for this forum, I think we're going to stick to the Gospels, if that's all right. So if you've got a particular one on the Gospels, that's fine. But I think we'll go to this gentleman first.
Well, here is a question about the languages of the Gospels. I don't know if you hear me.
Okay, languages of the Gospels. Keep your mouth close to the microphone.
What evidence do we...
The angle.
What evidence do we...
No, it's not the angle.
Like this?
It's clicking off. It's not working.
What evidence?
Do we have... Well, I'll just...
What evidence do we have?
Of the Gospels, say Matthew, having been written in Aramaic as opposed to Greek.
What evidence do we have that the Gospels haven't been written in Aramaic rather than Greek? The church historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, quotes Papias or Papias from the early 2nd century, saying that Matthew composed his story te Hebraidi dialecto, in the Hebrew dialect, and that each one translated them as they could. And people are puzzled over that. What does Hebrew mean? Does it mean what we call Hebrew? Does it mean what we call Aramaic? Does it mean Jewish? Does dialect mean language, or does it mean style? But it does seem that it was most early taken that there had been a Hebrew version of Matthew. When we look at the Greek text of Matthew that we have, it doesn't show obvious signs of having been made from a translation. There are some Aramaic words, raka, that come up in it, and so on. But sometimes things are translations and you simply can't tell from them because they've been done so well. So what I'd say is, outside of what people said, we don't have current documentary evidence about that. So my own view is that Matthew's Gospel, in the earliest manuscripts, comes associated with Matthew, and that he, is very closely involved with the authorship of that version. Certainly, I think there are signs in Matthew's Gospel, although it's probably the Gospel for which it's hardest to give the strong case for its Matthean authorship, or authorship by its traditional author. But I think there are signs within it that it does come from that early stage, and therefore isn't going to be far removed from someone like Matthew.
And a quick one, if I may, to follow that up. Is there any evidence that the ones that are supposed to have been written in Greek were actually not written by a native speaker of Greek? Not really. Of Jesus' 12 disciples, 2 have Greek names, Philip and Andrew. And the majority of gravestones in Palestine are in Greek. There were Greek-speaking synagogues in Jerusalem. So it's possible for someone to be in that land and know Greek. So I would say, when I look at Luke, it's written in, very stylish Greek for the first 4 verses, and then he fits it, he goes into a sort of Old Testament style of Greek. With Mark, it's a simpler, rougher Greek, and John, a very simple Greek, but then it's a very profound thought system you've got in there. So I don't think there are signs that you could say were non-native. I don't see those. We've got a gentleman over there.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that this is relatively recent research that you did. So I guess my question is twofold. How much have your conclusions of this research, how much has it been published? And what, if any, scholarly responses or criticisms have you received, and how do you respond to those responses?
Thank you. Great question. The stuff by Borkham on the names, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that's been out for close to a decade, and there's been quite a bit of a response, and I think generally a pretty positive response. Some of this material I have hasn't yet been published, but I'm not sure how to do it. I could put that thing about, oh look, all of the place names have, all of the Gospels have about 5 place names per 1,000 words in a 1-line article. It's there. What do you do with that? And it's very difficult sometimes to ask those sort of big paradigmatic questions. And in order to do what really needs to be done with that, which I just put out for you, is we need to go through all of the other ancient writings and look at frequencies and these sort of things. And as with any trend and statistic like that, it invites various explanations. So I'd say it doesn't look very inviting to an explanation that says they put it in for verisimilitude. But, that's as far as I can go. But it's not really in the state that I think can be put out easily in an article. Some things just don't go in articles, they have to go in books because of their nature in larger arguments. But, that's what I'd say. And the thing about, speech marks, I only noticed a couple of, Jesus... always in quotation marks. I only noticed a couple of years ago and haven't yet written it up. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. That gentleman first, and then the microphone can come down here.
Excuse me. During your talk, you said that you didn't want to can't remember your exact words, defend all the stories in all of the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
What would you possibly be referring to?
Thank you. What I was saying, I think, was my argument isn't a defence of all of the stories in all of the Gospels. Now, here we come on to sort of issues of trust. And what I'd say is with history tends to be set up somewhat as a discipline whereby in order for something to be historically verified, we're wanting it by two sources, we're wanting to be able to have that sort of critical engagement with it and say, aha, we can now establish that this happened. That's the discipline of history, which is somewhat different from what we do in real life, where regularly we take something on a single testimony. So if you're going out for a romantic date and your date says to you, I've just been doing this, and you say, can you corroborate that? The date won't go very well. So the thing about that is there are some things in the Gospels that we can verify in that sort of historical way. It may still be rational to give credence to things that cannot be verified in that sort of way. Now, one of the things that's maybe the default setting in the discipline of history as exercised in all sorts of faculties is if, as one Cambridge academic once did, when someone says, we have Hitler diaries, and he said, I think these are genuine, and then they turned out not to be genuine, you have big egg on your face. On the other hand, if you said, as G.R. Driver did when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, I think these probably aren't genuine, that did not stick with his reputation at all through his career. So we do have, if you like, a problem with history as it's practiced, if you then try and extrapolate from that to what happened, because there isn't an adequate forfeit for skepticism. Does that make sense? There's no... Whereas in investments, well, I was talking to someone in investments today, and he said it didn't matter whether they went up or down, he was going to win anyway. But, you know, for simple investments, you know, there's a forfeit either way. And I do think there is that, you know, question with history that it's very easy to be sceptical, like to say, I don't believe in that, and that person, at least in, you know, the foreseeable future, isn't going to come back and say, actually, I did exist. So I just wanting to say, what I'm seeking to do is establish the broad framework of taking the gospel seriously, saying that they do have reliable material. That isn't necessarily the full extent of all that maybe should be trusted, but you need, in order to work out what you should trust, to have a broader framework of working that out. Does that make sense? I think we had a question down here.
So given that we are discussing tonight the truth of eyewitness accounts in the New Testament, the truth of eyewitness accounts in the New Testament, how should we regard the accounts of the Old Testament, and like how literal should we take?
Well, that's a big question because it's a big lot. You can do a sort of name argument on the Old Testament. And it goes like this. There are tons of names in the Old Testament. Was it 19,000? Lots. Anyway, you can go and count. One of the things that we have is we do have documents from outside the Old Testament showing that at a particular stage in Israelite history, names ending in English, IAH, Yah, Jeremiah, okay, Isaiah, so on, Zephaniah, yeah? Become very, very popular. If I go through the first 5 books of the Bible, I don't find those sorts of names. That's pretty striking. Some people like to say that those 5 books of the Old Testament were composed from the 9th through to the 5th centuries, which is a time when those IAH names were incredibly popular, and that they come together from 4 different sources, put together by 2 different editors. If they are, they did an amazing job of editing out any of the names that wouldn't have fitted with the time. So there are those sort of name patterns that you can look at. There's a book by K.A. Kitchen on the reliability of the Old Testament. Ken's a good friend of mine, Egyptologist in Liverpool for many years, and an amazing guy who's probably read more of ancient literature than anyone else alive. He puts out some of these sorts of arguments, and you can visit his house, which is a small house with 19,000 books inside, everywhere, including the bedroom line. That sort of argument can be used. But I think, tonight, I don't want to get drawn too far off. We're looking at the Gospels, and I think they have a certain level of evidence in favour of taking them seriously as history. I'm sort of looking for a chair to decide when to cut questions short. I mean, I could go on for ages, but I just don't want to, use people's time too much. So,
hi, could I ask a question?
Yeah. Right. I'm not guaranteeing an answer.
Okay, I have two of them. I don't know if that's okay.
Choose the more difficult.
Yeah. First one, I noticed that you put John next to the synoptics without any kind of, making any differentiation between them. Mm-hmm. And, in liberal theology, they kind of tend to discredit John for being later, for using different terminology, different language of Jesus. So I wonder if you can how is John unique when it comes to your work, and how can your work bring more credibility to the text of John?
Thank you. The Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark and Luke are more similar to each other than John is to them. John doesn't have parables, at least not obviously so. He's got Jesus saying some things like, I am this, I am that, I am the bread of life, I am the resurrection and the life, and so on, which you don't have in the synoptics. And so, people have said, well, it's a different voice. How can you, take this together and say, it's a good historical source? Don't we have to choose one or the other? What I'd say with that is that there are subtle ways in which John and the synoptics agree, which are really quite indirect. For instance, on the chronology of the Passion Week, John has a certain thing happening 6 days before the Passover. The synoptics fill in what might have happened on those 6 days, but don't, lay out the days quite the same way. The way John describes Jesus' crucifixion clearly is that he was crucified on the eve of Passover. That agrees with the Talmud, which says he was crucified on the eve of Passover. The synoptics, it's not at all obvious that Jesus is crucified on the eve of Passover, although I think they can be read to be consistent with that. So when I look at, say, the accounts of the resurrection, in Matthew's Gospel, you have some women running away from the empty tomb, and it says, when they saw Jesus, they held onto his feet. John has a very different account of that, and just Mary's there. She turns and sees Jesus. And then Jesus says to her, do not cling on to me. Which is very odd, because it doesn't say she clung on to him and then he said, do not cling on to me. It just simply has the saying presupposing a bit of information which is consistent with the other Gospels. And then what they both say is, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, go and tell my brothers I'm going to Galilee. Well, Jesus doesn't normally call the disciples his brothers. In John's Gospel, do not cling on to me, but go and tell my brothers that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Well, that's pretty odd. It's got another phrase snatched from there. And what you find is when you compare the speeches, they are very different, and yet there are striking things that are the same. And even in the use of the phrase Son of Man, some of the ways it's used in John's Gospel, when you look deep down at the themes, it's actually quite similar to what's going on in the other Gospels. So what I'd say is it's different, and yet I think you could use that difference as it could either be used as evidence against the reliability of one or the other strands of tradition, or if you can establish it is a separate standard tradition, if you do get those subtle agreements, it can then become part of an argument for there being some truth underlying them both.
I'm excited about this. I listened to your discussion with Bart Ehrman on Unbelievable on your radio. And he was stuck on a verse in Hebrews where the word would change the meaning and so on. You might remember this. And I wonder if you could apply your tests to terms and idioms used in the Gospels and also the epistles, and compare them to other literature and to see if you can kind of in a way respond to Bart Ehrman in that way with the language.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I mean, I've debated him, and we might debate against him.
Yeah, well, the thing is, his argument about the discrepancy between the manuscripts and so on, and that was his argument. So I wonder if you can use those tests here and apply them to text, to idioms, to words,
right,
and see if you can do the same thing.
I mean, what I'd say is, he's a great expert on New Testament manuscripts, but I differ with him fundamentally on interpretation, and I think there's also a question of rhetoric as well. So, what I think Bart Ehrman has shown from his work on manuscripts, in which he wrote this famous book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, Oxford University Press, arguing that it was the Orthodox, if you like, kosher Christians, maybe that's not quite the right expression, but ones that are really supposed to be on the right side, that were the ones that changed Scripture to make it fit their case. And he tries to give 150 cases of this, or something like that. My take on what he's done there is that actually he's shown rather the opposite. He has gone over 5,000 or more manuscripts and tried to find the very best cases across all manuscripts that fit his case, and most of them don't. And that's a very few changes for, we've got 2.6 million pages of New Testament manuscripts. That's a lot where you ought to be able to find more data to fit your case, if it's a good case. So I would say, I'm not convinced of the argument that he makes. One more question. So the last person, tonight's winner, is, you've got the microphone, it's you. Yeah.
So my question is pretty simple, I think. But basically, your fifth point was about the Jewishness of the Gospels. And I was just wondering, what exactly we were talking about when you said the Jewishness. Are you talking about the writing style, or?
One of the things about the Jewishness, there are many aspects of Jewishness, is the emphasis on the Old Testament. John's Gospel begins in the beginning, just as the Old Testament begins. Matthew's Gospel begins with a genealogy, just like in Genesis. Luke's Gospel begins with a couple of figures, just like the Old Testament in 1 Samuel. It's a story quite similar. Then they all have this emphasis on the fulfillment of prophecy. They look back to the Old Testament books, the first part of the Bible, and they say, this is being fulfilled now. That's not something you get in those Gospels. They're not saying God's purposes amongst the Jewish people is being fulfilled. But that's actually a major theme. Then you come to the symbolism, you come to aspects of the culture. These sorts of things are Jewish. The talk about the various Jewish groups, the way that Christians, when you have a discussion of the law, when you have a discussion of the law in the Gospels by Jesus, it's not the sort of discussion of the law that went on amongst early Christians. Are we supposed to keep the law? That isn't even talked about. The question is, what does the law mean? How do we apply it? Those are the questions that are being dealt with. So I think, it's one of those things that doesn't seem to be very disputed. That the more you look at the Gospels, the more Jewish they are. And when you look at Jesus's teaching, that can be very well understood. The better you understand Jewish background, rabbinic debate of the time. That's what I'd say.
Why don't we thank Dr. Williams again?
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.